Your child just qualified for special education services. Now what? Here's what no one tells you about that first meeting. My name is Nick, and this is the Spedspace podcast. Welcome back, guys. We've been working on looking at kind of the process of special education. Your child just qualified. You had testing done. Your child was evaluated. You went over the evaluations. You went through the eligibility determination meeting, which we talked about last episode. And you were able to answer yes to the 3 questions that we talked about last episode. Go watch it, hint, hint. But it's, do they have a disability? Does it have an adverse impact on their educational performance? And does that adverse impact rise to the level of requiring specially designed instruction? If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the last episode. But they've qualified. So now what? Well, we develop an IEP. So depending on the district, you might develop an IEP right then and there. So the same meeting that you just qualified them under, you might develop an IEP, or you might have another one after, very quickly after, because remember, it needs to get done within a certain time frame. But either way, you're going to develop an IEP. So an initial evaluation, this is your first time looking at an IEP, what is going to be in there? So the nice thing about developing an IEP, there's pros and cons with an eligibility determination meeting, is that is the most up-to-date data that you're going to have right after an evaluation, right? You're going to have really in-depth evaluation data, and you're going to use that directly in the IEP. So how the IEP looks like, it's different in every, not just state, but districts will look different. But typically it'll start off with some just like kind of demographic information, who your kid is, where they go to school, what disability category are they qualified under, when was their meeting, or when is their, what it keeps a timeline of things, the purpose of the meeting, so what kind of meeting it is. This is now going to be an annual meeting. This will be your first one, and it'll happen every year around this time. It has to happen every year around this time. Well, at least, right? It can happen more often, but at least happen once a year. And then typically the first major section will be the meeting minutes. So what was discussed in the meeting? This is very much, you're creating the document and then you receive it after. And I'll go over about all the documents that receive after the meeting, but you'll receive this after. So it gets done now. So it's the meeting minutes are they're the notes. What was discussed? What did you guys discuss at the meeting? Then we get into the first, like, really important, it's all important, but the really important category, which is it depends on the district. They always look so different, but it'll be the academic performance or the present levels of performance or something along those lines. And those are typically broken up into 4 sections per difficulty area. So if your child has difficulty in reading, there'll be a goal area reading. Or if your child has a difficulty in in math or in behavior or speech, each will have its own section. Okay, so first it'll say, and again, it might be slightly different order of things, but it'll have like the baseline data, which you guys, again, you just had a ton because you did the evaluation report. This will be things like how are they performing with, let's just stick with reading. How are they performing with their decoding, with their fluency, with their comprehension? It is specifically within that, if they are struggling with decoding, where are they struggling? What are they struggling with? Something for fluency or comprehension, or more general, whatever it may be. Then it'll be strengths. So what is your child really good at? What can we leverage in order to help them learn? What are some highlights? And then arguably the most important section is the concern/needs section. This is really important because obviously it's what your child needs to work on, but anything that's in this section needs to be addressed in the IEP. So you don't put everything, because obviously there's infinite things that every human being on this planet can work on. We're going to work on the most pressing things that we think we can address within 1 year time. Okay, so from now until a year from now, what can we address and improve upon and or provide a skill that can overcome that issue or that difficulty? And then an impact statement. And the impact statement is just a general kind of comment on where they're struggling. So like a very basic one, if the kid's name is Jimmy, due to Jimmy's difficulty in decoding or with decoding, Jimmy requires text to speech and specific reading intervention support in order to access the general education curriculum. Something along those lines. I'm just making it up. It's obviously a lot easier when you have an actual student to do that with, but some kind of statement there that kind of describes what's going on. Also, so that'll be done for each area of difficulty. Now, historically, depending on the IEP, it might have everything listed, and they'll just say, like, let's say they only have struggle in reading and they don't have any struggles in math. It'll say, like, not applicable for math. Kind of how everything's kind of getting digitized nowadays and a little bit more streamlined. Math just won't be in the IEP. So when I'm, as an advocate, when I'm reading an IEP, if I see that they have reading and writing goals and nothing with math, I'm going to make the assumption, unless I hear otherwise, of course, or I see otherwise in the data, that they're on grade level with math, for example. Okay. And that would also be true with like communication or behavior or daily living skills or whatever, right? So the next thing to consider in this section 2, which is critically important, is somewhere there should be parent and or student input or something along those lines. That's your section. It's really powerful because those sections need to be filled out. So what I would recommend to you, I remember a few episodes ago, and I've actually had a podcast specifically on prepared written statement, and I bring it up often. It is critical. It's not an official like lingo. Prepared written statement is something that I came up with. It's just a literal prepared written statement by the parent. But you write it up and you ask them to put it directly into the IEP and copy and paste it. And why we do that is it creates a written record of what your concerns are, and because they're concerns, they need to be addressed. Now, this district doesn't have to necessarily agree with the concerns, but they have to note their agreement or disagreement in writing in some capacity. They don't necessarily say we agree directly, but they'll add a goal that addresses the concern you have, for example, or add an accommodation that addresses the concern you have. That's how they address that. If they straight up disagree, they'd have to put that in the prior written notice. We'll get to that in a little bit. Or directly in the meeting notes too. So you have the present levels of performance. That should be pretty easy to do because you just had the evaluation meeting. So you might not even really go, like when I used to conduct meetings, I wouldn't even really spend that much time at an initial annual going over that because it's like, hey, we just went over all these goals, went over all these areas of strength and areas of concern, but let's hone in on the concern areas because that's going to guide the IEP. So I would go over those, but I wouldn't necessarily like say all of the baseline data again because it's just redundant. All right. So you have all that done. And then you move on to goals and objectives. Or goals, sorry. Connecticut has goals and objectives. Depending on the IEP, you might have both goals and objectives or just goals, depending on the state, depending on the disability category. There's lots of things. But you'll definitely have at least goals. And goals are measurable skills or measurable. I mean, I always think of them as skills, something that they are going to be able to do, and what they can't do now, and what we think they can do in a year from now. So, it's April 2026 as of recording this. What do we think they're going to be able to do in April 2027, and then get them there? Okay, so you write out a goal. It needs to be measurable. I could do a whole show on just goals, and I'm sure I will at some point. But basically, it needs to be something along the lines of, student will be able to do, or given something, given a math worksheet, given a reading passage on their grade level or reading level, or I mean that's kind of outdated, but given a multisyllabic word for decoding, something like along those lines. Student will read the word. Student will decode the word. Student will break down the word. Student will, whatever the skill is, what are we trying to teach them? If it's a math problem, student will underline the question, circle the appropriate information, highlight the operation that needs to be, whatever, right? Set up the equation. You can get into this. It's infinite things you can do, literally. But basically, what is the skill we want them to do? And then, so given X, student will Y by a certain date with 80% accuracy, or with 4 out of 5 opportunities, or 3 out of 5, or 5 out of 5, or 100%. I mean, it depends on what the goal is and what the skill is. 80% is kind of like the default. 80%. And you might be like, well, I want my kid to get A's. It's an appropriate education, and 80% it's good. It's slightly above average. And then keep in mind, we're working on below skills, so getting them to that level, like close by, is good. Also depends on the skill. I remember when I was very first starting off, I was considering becoming a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst, and that it requires extensive observational hours and a different degree. I have a master's in special education. It's another degree that you have to get. And so one of my colleagues was becoming a BCBA, and they were doing the practice test. So I, just for fun, was like, I want to take the practice test, see how I see my knowledge, see what I know. And I remember this. I'm so used to that 80% thing. Like everything's 80%. And so one of the questions was, I forget the exact wording, but the gist of it was, what is an acceptable criteria for success, or what, like basically what's percentage of success for the behavior of not jumping out of a car, of a moving vehicle. And I'm like, 80%, I guess. Like, well, you're not thinking, like, again, I'm much younger. It probably sounds silly now. Maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't sound silly, you're like my younger self, which is it needs to be 100%, because you can't be jumping out of a moving car ever. Unless you're, a Hollywood stunt double or whatever, right? Doing some stunts, like you can't jump out of a moving vehicle. Like that's not acceptable ever. That needs to happen 0% of the time, or like you need to be in the car 100% of the time, however you want to word it, right? But there's no 80% there. It's not like it's acceptable 1 out of 5 times to jump out of the car when you're heading to Wendy's, right? Like no, like this, never. So I always remember that. But for most things, 80% is the marker for success. Sometimes if it's very difficult, we might drop it down to 70. Sometimes you'll see 2 out of 3, so 66%, but that's usually they want you to do it 2 out of 3 times, and it's something that you're not going to be doing that often, like maybe an essay creation within like narrative writing, or a persuasive essay. Like you're not going to do too many in a year, and you're not going to make a kid do that many. So you'll like build up to that, and then you'll do a final like 2 out of 3 with this criteria. It gets intricate, and that's where it's good to have an advocate or just a really good team. But you just ask why, ask them to justify it. Why are we doing 80% for this? Why are we doing 70% for this? Why are we doing 90% for this? For the decoding ones, those are usually a lot higher. Those might be like 98% of the time, 99% of the time when they're reading. So it kind of depends on what we're working on. So that's the goal. Then there's other sections too. There's a lot of important information, but generally the next one is going to be the actual services. So the goals are going to drive the services. So you're then looking at, okay, what are services? Those are when you're seeing the special education teacher, when you're seeing the speech therapist or psychologist or whatever your child needs. That's how often. So usually it's written, it depends. A lot of districts do different things. I've seen, typically I'll see like 5 by 30 minutes a week, which means that they'll meet like daily for 30 minutes. I've seen it written sometimes as like 4 by 120 minutes a month, which means that they'll meet for 1 30-minute session each week is kind of what that means. It just depends on how they write it, but that's kind of how that works. So they'll have who's responsible for implementing and who's responsible for providing the service. And the difference there is basically who's directly like working with the student and who's in charge of the service. Typically it's the same person, but every now and then it's not. Every now and then you might have, like, for example, a special education teacher's responsible for implementing, but then the provider is both a special education teacher and the general education teacher, or a special education teacher and a paraprofessional. So there's like multiple people that can technically provide the service, but the implementer or the person, again, that's like taking the data and in charge of it and reporting back to you, that's who you want to look at. And then there should be a site code. So like, where is the service taking place? Is it being done in the classroom, the gen ed classroom? Is it being done in the resource setting? Is it being done in a one-to-one setting, a group setting, a whole group, small group, individual? What does it look like? So you have that. Then you typically have accommodations and modifications and tech assistance, all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be your things like preferential seating, text to speech, speech to text. Why am I blanking out? There's like a million accommodations. Access to gum, extra time on tests and quizzes. I'm like literally struggling right now. This is something I do all the time. And there's so many accommodations that you could have. Check-ins for understanding, have student repeat information back, providing graphic organizers, multiplication tables, calculators, access to calculators, frequent movement breaks, things like that, right? Access to an inhaler, access to an EpiPen, things like that. Those would all go in the accommodations, okay? Also, depending on the district, that might be where a paraprofessional is listed as well, either a shared paraprofessional or one-to-one paraprofessional, things like that. That'll also have modifications, and I could do a whole episode on the difference between accommodation and modifications, but very quickly, accommodations are things that we're changing throughout the day in order to help the child access the general education curriculum, but they're still expected to access the same content. Modifications is they are truly doing something different. There's a different level of criteria and what we're working on with them. There's other things too that I skipped over. So like during the services section, you'll have like ESY, extended school year, potentially in there, accommodations, modifications. It keeps going. There's a few other sections, special transportation, the justification for special education services and like how often they're getting pulled out, things like that. Everything is important in the IEP, everything. But those are the major sections, the present levels of performance, the goals, the accommodations, and the service page. Those are like the big chunk of it, but everything is important. So you'll create that IEP right then and there. As I mentioned last episode, the first IEP is usually the weakest one. And the reason being is typically the special education teacher barely knows the child, depending on how your district does things. One of the districts I worked at, we had an evaluation team for initials. So for new prospective kids in special education. So like I didn't even do the testing. So I there's possible that I've only met this child through the first meeting and like putting a face to the name. Like, okay, Jimmy's getting tested. Like, let me just go check him out and like just get eyes on him. And then when it's time to write an IEP, I'm basing it off of the reports that I've read and their current functioning rather than like actually interacting with the child. So typically you stay with the same special education teacher for a few years. So like the second and third IEPs get a lot stronger. And then going on, if I'm handing the child off to somebody, I could talk to that SPED teacher and be like, hey, this is what we're working on. This is what he needs to work on, et cetera, et cetera. So they get stronger over the years and they get more pinpointed. And you can always call a meeting. You can always call a meeting to review the IEP. So you don't have to go crazy with the initial IEP. I would say the most important things are the services, because those are hard. So services are always harder to change outside of an annual, because technically every time you have an annual, it's like a new IEP from scratch. Technically, I mean, you're still going to take stuff from the previous year to update. Like the accommodations aren't going to change too much. The goals should be changing and the PLEP should be changing, but that it should be kind of roughly the same for some of those things. So the services can be tricky because you kind of have determined like this is an appropriate level of support. Those of you out there that are trying to get more support for a child, keep in mind it's you want to make an argument, or you want to say like they need more goals, or something's not working, or they're not making progress, and then more services would be justified at that point. But yeah, I mean, after the meeting, you're going to receive some documentation, okay? First thing, if you haven't already, you should receive a finalized version of the evaluation reports. We're talking about, again, this is coming off an initial, like your kid just qualified. If your kid's already qualified, a little different, but this is, I'm talking to like new parents here. But even parents of kids that already have special education services, you're still going to get the same documentation. You'll get a finalized IEP within 5 days of the meeting being done. Okay, so just mind you, 5 school days. You'll get a finalized IEP. This is the IEP at this point. And you'll get something called a prior written notice. And a prior written notice is the most annoying name for a document, at least for me. I mean, maybe it makes sense for other people, but I've heard it mess up a lot of people. Prior written notice is a document that you get after the PPT, or after the IEP meeting. Sorry, in Connecticut they're called PPT meetings, planning and placement team meetings. New York they're called Committee of Special Education. They're different in every state. So after an IEP meeting, you get a prior written notice, and it's prior to the IEP being implemented, of what the district has proposed and refused, and what their justification is of those proposals and refusals. Typically, if everything's going well, you guys have agreed on everything, and it's just letting you know that this is what they plan to implement. They plan to implement an IEP with X amount of services and yada yada. That is a critical document, critically important. It's sometimes only 1 page, maybe 2 pages, or maybe a back and front. It's a short document, but it is critical. You definitely save that. Do not throw anything out ever, but definitely save the prior written notices. If you guys disagreed on something, you could technically, you might get multiple prior written notices. So like you'll have one with all the agreements and then one with the refusals, or you might get multiple ones with refusals. But basically what that means is you requested something and the district said no, then it's a refusal. So you've proposed an action, you proposed 5 times a week of speech and they only want to give 3, right? So you've proposed something and they said no. And what that document does is you can go file a complaint or go to due process, which is a whole other thing. I mean, you could do that with or without the document, but it keeps an accurate record of what was recorded. And so if you make a proposal in the meeting and they refuse it, insist on having a prior written notice about it, because they have to provide justification. I did a whole episode on prior written notices and how you can leverage that to actually get, the things that you want. But yeah, that's all I got for you today. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, ask any questions about anything special education related if you want me to talk about it on the show. If you are listening to this on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, please also follow the show. You can leave a comment. Let me know what you're enjoying about this, something that you learned, something that you'd like me to discuss as well. You can do that on YouTube as well. And thank you guys. If you want to reach out, my Instagram is at GSE Advocates, which is Greenwich Special Education Advocates. That's my Instagram handle. And you can email me at thespedspace@gmail.com. If you guys need any help with advocacy services, my website is www.greenwichseadvocates.com. All this should be in the description below. But if you guys need anything, please reach out. I do free consultations as of now. As of the recording of this, we'll see what happens as the business continues to grow. And keep it here for the future. I am down the line looking to grow and create a community where we can collaborate and work together and get a little bit more specifics. I'm looking to some options here and there to be able to do some kind of content that I can't necessarily do on YouTube. Not in a bad way, but just for like looking at IEPs, for example, of children. I wouldn't want to do. I don't think any parent wants their kid's IEP out in the public, area. So looking to do some kind of content that that we can do, maybe some redacted names or whatnot. But yeah. Anyway, thank you for watching or listening, and I hope you have a lovely day. Good luck at your meetings. You're gonna kill it. Just prepare and read a lot about your kids' education and their documents and their data and all that stuff. All right. Have a great day.